tabletop games, tabletop miniatures games, miniature war games, skirmish games. What is what? What do Warhammer 40k, Malifaux, Infinity all have in common? In this video, we are going to discuss with you what is and is not a miniatures game. Roll that intro. Welcome to Corner Case. You're in the hobby corner, and I am your host, your deductive reasoning, and your best friend, Deck. In this video, together, that's right, you're a part of this, we will attempt to define what is and is not a miniature war game. I want more people to understand our hobby, to enjoy our hobby. I want to give our hobby more visibility, and defining miniature wargame is a part of that. Please comment along. I by no means think that my answers here are definitive. This is but the start of a conversation, so let's get to it. So within tabletop games, I think there are four big categories that all kind of tend to blur together. And I think those four categories are board games like Settlers of Catan, card games like Magic the Gathering, tabletop RPGs like D&D, Pathfinder, and finally, miniature war games like Warhammer 40k, Infinity, Malifaux, the main subject of our channel Corner Case. Except is Gloomhaven an RPG or a board game? Is Underworlds a miniatures game or a card game or a board game? Why isn't Pathfinder considered a miniatures game? I'm sure there are answers within the rich history of our great hobby to explain why all of these subcategories have kind of bled together, and I'm sure it's in the development history, but that is for another video. We're going to approach the topic of what is and is not a miniatures game from two directions. The first direction is by establishing a baseline. Now, if you have not disagreed with me yet, now is the time that you probably will. And my belief is, or my thesis rather, after you strip away the flavor, the mechanics, the RNGs, all that, the specifics, the lore, the world building, I think the baseline of a miniatures war game is chess. Here is my argument for why chess is the baseline for miniatures war game. It's 1v1 gameplay. It simulates a conflict between two groups of models. It has models. Those models are, as a player, your primary resource, and it has a combat system that focuses on positioning matters mechanics. Let's go over each one of those really quick. 1v1 gameplay. I think the 1v1 gameplay is important to note because games like tabletop RPG games like D&D, Pathfinder, while I have seen people PvP those, the primary design is around a cooperative experience. This is the same in the board game realm, where many board games are designed for cooperative or PvP multiplayer experiences. And it's only recently that I've seen a solo mode or just 1v1 mode in board games really becoming more popular. So it's still important, I think, to note that the 1v1 gameplay is an important component of almost every wargame design that I've played. So you look at Warhammer 40k, Infinity the game, Malifaux, and while you can play formats within those games that do multiplayer, for the most part, those are designed as 1v1 games. Simulating a conflict between two groups. This is related to the 1v1 gameplay, but I think it's still a very important distinction to make. I've played formats within games like Malifaux. Like Malifaux has a format Enforcer Brawl where you pilot a single model in usually a multiplayer type of format, but that's definitely not the primary format. When you have multiple models, it places a bigger emphasis on positioning matters mechanics. Games like D&D or a board game like Eldritch Horror, in those games you're usually piloting like a single character, and I think the single character type of gameplay, rather than emphasizing positioning, really emphasizes more of a role play type of experience. Has miniatures. So I don't really want to argue that miniature war games require miniatures as a part of the experience, but I do still think it's important to clarify because there is a whole category of tabletop war games that are simulations of wartime events. Like I've seen one that is no miniatures whatsoever. I think it's just cards, but you're simulating like landing on the beaches of Normandy, you know, So there are a big category of war games that simulate wartime events that do not require miniatures at all. So it's still important. I don't want to argue it, but it is still important to distinguish miniatures required in miniature war games. Your models are your primary resource. So I've been thinking about this one and I have convinced myself that this is a very succinct way to describe this requirement. So you play a board game like Scythe or Blood Rage. Let's just take Scythe. You have your wood, oil, metal, food. You have your workers. You do worker placement. You have your mechs. You do combat. You have your main character. There's just like a lot of layers of mechanics going on. However, in miniature war games, by and large, the games that I've played and enjoyed, the primary resource is absolutely your models. Let's take Infinity, for example. Each model generates an order. Orders can be spent on your troopers to perform actions to complete objectives. Fewer models equals fewer orders. So the game incentivizes you to deny your opponent resources by killing off their models. No models, no orders, no ability to act. This equates right back to chess, where your models, your chess pieces, equate to your capability to complete your tactical objectives. That's not to say that there are not alternative resources. In 40K, you have command points. In Infinity, you have command tokens, Malifaux soul stones, also cards. But absolutely, by and large, your tactical capability is tied to your models. I also want to note that this is separate from the way a game designs its win conditions. So in many games like Infinity and Malifaux, which I would consider pretty good games, you're able to win even if your models have all completely died. So my argument here is very narrow, that your models are your primary resource that you use to complete your objectives, but that is separate from a game's scoring design. Finally, positioning-focused combat mechanics. This one is super, I think, abstract to explain, but it goes back to chess. The entire game is a positioning-only combat system. In Infinity, you have your gun range bands. You have a similar mechanic in 40K. Rapid-fire weapons shoot double at half range, you need a specific positioning requirement in order to perform melee combat. In Malifaux, every single sub-faction has its own specific positioning requirements, independent of the game's scoring requirements. So positioning matters. Combat mechanics, I think, is an important requirement for miniature wargames. I think these are the minimum requirements. However, there probably are more. In order to test our idea, do we think that Warhammer 40K, Infinity, and Malifaux have all of these? That's your 1v1 gameplay, simulates a conflict between two groups, has miniature models, has positioning-focused combat mechanics, and your army is your primary resource? Yes, I think this is true for all three of the games that I listed. Now, I think a lot of wargamers are probably thinking, like, in terms of requirements, like, what about the lore? What about the immersion? I agree with you. However, I think the lore and the immersion components of wargames, while they're a big part of the hobby for people, those aspects are really difficult to qualify. So I had a hard time rationalizing making them part of our working definition for miniature wargame. For example, let's talk about how immersion is achieved in miniature wargames. I think immersion is usually achieved with like a beautiful game board, your 4x4, your 3x6, your 3x3 game boards that are like flocked, beautiful terrain. If you compare Infinity and Malifaux, both great games, but their terrain requirement mechanically is very different. You can get away with just a little bit of terrain on a Malifaux board, but in an Infinity board, you need quite a lot of terrain. And to take this to an extreme, if we look at Guild Ball, I think Guild Ball was a very, very good miniatures game. However, you were usually just playing Guild Ball with a bunch of mouse pads. You have your 3x3 pitch mouse pad, and then you have all your little terrain mouse pads, and that just wasn't very immersive, but it was still a good game, and it kind of like did the minimum requirement to get that immersion happening. Next, in regards to the world building and the lore component of miniature war games, I have a number of reasons why I don't think that's like a good requirement. First reason, again, chess. Second reason, historical war games exist. You know, not all wargamers really need to know the lore. I was playing Malifaux pretty seriously, trying to play competitively, going to tournaments for a number of years, and I was definitely not the player type who was super immersed in the lore. I think the distribution of the lore is pretty spotty. I think games like 40K have very good distribution of their lore. Malifaux and Infinity, while they try, still don't have as good of a distribution because it is partially based on the community. I think lore and world building at the functional level are there to rationalize the conflicts that are playing out in game. Another thing I've considered but deliberately omitted is army list building. So most games that I have played have had an army list building mechanic as a part of the gameplay experience. But some games kind of turn that upside down or do it differently. In Guild Ball, while you have selected your faction, when you go to an organized play event at the beginning of a game, you still draft from your roster. So there's still some flexibility at the front end of the game. In Malifaux, you absolutely build your list like right when you're about to play. In the new Kill Team, there almost is no list building. In God Tier, what is list building in God Tier? You know, you take your champion and their minions. You know, it's different in every game. So I thought that it wasn't necessarily a good requirement because some games have it, some games have it different. It is either a part of the gameplay or it's not. So list building, ultimately decided not a requirement. Now, hopefully some of you agree with me and we're feeling comfortable because now we are going to blow it up. Is Warhammer Underworlds a miniature war game? Warhammer Underworlds, it's sold in what looks like a board game format and contains everything in that box that two people need to play, including models, boards, cards, tokens. The game combines a gridded miniature combat system with randomized objective cards and also a plot card deck that you build yourself. For me, personally, this game scratches my miniature wargame itch. I think it is one, but I have a feeling my opinion isn't super popular. I've talked to a lot of people about this over the last like 3 years-ish, and some of the things that people tell me about why they don't think it is a miniature war game or why they think it doesn't feel like a miniature war game. It's more of a card game, or it's more of a board game, or I don't like how you have to collect all of the expansions in order to collect all the cards that you need to play a good deck. Now, anyone I've spoken to who's actually played this game has never said that it was a bad game, has never complained about the mechanics. But a lot of people are saying it doesn't feel like a miniature war game. While people haven't outright said it's not a miniature war game, I think saying that it doesn't feel like one implies a lot. And, you know, part of this is the subconscious experience of the game. When you go to the store, it comes in a compact board game sized box. All the expansions come in board game sized boxes. When you open your board game sized box, it has cardboard in there, a lot of cardboard. When you collect the game, you end up with at least half your investment is cardboard, and that's a little bit different from what we might consider a traditional war game. But let's run it through the gamut of our list, our minimum requirements for miniature war games, if you will. Does it have 1v1 gameplay? Yes. Does it simulate a conflict between two groups of miniatures? Yes. Does it have miniatures? Yes. Are your miniatures your primary resource? Ultimately, I decided to say yes on this one, but we have to talk about why it could be a little bit weird. Yes, you absolutely pilot a group of miniatures, but you have your deck of plot cards that enhance your miniatures' playability on the battlefield. It includes a combination of effects cards and equipment cards. And the amount of effect that that deck of cards has on the quality of your miniatures gameplay is big enough that it's kind of hard for me to say that it's not like a primary resource, but ultimately, if you don't have models on the board, you're not doing anything. So ultimately, I said yes on a technicality here, But I can see how this one being a little funny could be the reason why people don't necessarily think this game feels like a miniature war game. Finally, position-focused combat mechanics. Absolutely, yes. One of the core mechanics in Underworlds is the support system. If you flank your opponent, you gain access to sides of the dice that would otherwise be considered blank. Your models can only move once per turn unless a special effect card grants it an ability otherwise. So there are a lot of positioning mechanics in this game. So absolutely yes. So now that we've run through why it could be a miniature war game, let's talk about what might disqualify it. We didn't really put hard rules around this one, but let's talk about it. Is the gridded cardboard map enough to disqualify Underworlds? I don't think so, because games like Hero Quest, Demon World, God Tier, Imperial Assault, all these games exist, and I think all of them at least have a little bit of respect. Is it Underworld's focus on cards gameplay? Probably, but it's not unheard of. You know, Star Wars Legion has the initiative cards. Some of those initiative cards are unique to your commander, and some of those initiative cards grant special effects as well. So the use of cards is to get in-game effects in a miniature war game is not unheard of. However, the more I think about it, the way the cards are implemented in Warhammer Underworlds is such that your deck of cards is actually your primary advantage over your opponent. You know, because you're unable to do list building in this game, if two of you come with a mirror match of factions, a lot of the success is going to come down to which person had the better deck. On top of that, collecting 50+% cardboard with your miniature wargame buying experience, I think is not how miniature wargamers are trained to spend money. I think it's a miniature war game, but I can see how people definitely think that it is not. What do you guys think? Is Warhammer Underworlds a miniature war game? What do you guys think are requirements for miniature war games? Do you agree? Do you disagree with my list? If you disagree, do you disagree like fundamentally, categorically? Do you just have modifications to my list? What do you think I missed? I really want to talk about this. So again, we can make our hobby more visible, easy to understand for new players. Please leave your comments below. Please like and subscribe. Thank you so much to our supporters on Patreon. Thank you so much for anyone who supports the channel. Thank you to the group of great people on Discord. Love talking to y'all every day. Again, just so grateful. See you guys next time.
I am ready to subscribe again.